So this is my weekly review of events week over week in Ukraine. I apologize, I'm a day behind. So we're going to look at last Monday to yesterday. It is Tuesday, October 24th as I'm speaking. So we'll start with Tuesday, October 23rd. Okay, so I'm just looking at article headlines and adding to that where I see that'll help you understand context. First headline in Pravda RU, that is Turkey moves to the Russian side of the barricades, that is they're supporting Gaza. Russia has a real stake in supporting Gaza and extending. It's not even that they want Gaza to win necessarily, but they want to extend the war, the conflict in Israel as much as possible in order to keep the world's attention off Ukraine. North Korea shipping ammunitions and weapons at scale to Russia, according to Radio Free Europe. Now, I think that that's right, and they are. Now, when Putin and Kim met, there was no agreed deal announced, but apparently behind the scenes, there was some kind of arrangement so that weapons would flow into Russia. Putin in China visiting his dear friend Xi. So I haven't heard of anything announced about that, like any kind of arrangement or agreement, but maybe it's a quiet agreement that we're just not familiar with. We're not hearing in the public. Russia is forced to close a school in Kherson for a lack of willing teachers. That's because they're trying to Russify the Ukrainians, and the teachers don't want to have anything to do with that. They'd rather be hungry or find something else to do than be able to be part of that. Zelensky confirms Ukraine is using long-range ATACMS from the United States. So this was the big announcement last week, or the big event last week, the ATACMS that hit the helicopters on the base, and they destroyed at least 9 was the original report, but it looks like they injured a number of other, injured is not the right word, but they disabled a number of other helicopters in the process as well, and that was really interesting to see. And at first, you couldn't tell that they were ATACMS, but you knew that it was out of range of what they had been able to fire before. So it turns out it was confirmed that they did use ATACMS. Zelensky thanks his partners for the supply of effective weapons. And then finally, there's a new type of war that faces General Brown. General Brown is the chair of the Joint Chiefs. I've asked a Air Force colonel and a retired Air Force general about Brown, and they have a very strong, favorable opinion of his competence, his ability to listen and think through issues, and he'll be a great chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Wednesday, 18 October, the U.S. is supplying long-range missiles to Kyiv. Just prolongs the agony for Ukraine, warns Putin. Of course, this is the message that Putin wants to communicate, that it's just it's an inevitable thing and you're just making it worse for yourself, so stop doing that. If they're saying stop doing that, if the Russians are saying stop doing that, that's probably something you ought to continue to do. Okay, Russia recruiting Serbs to replenish forces. Well, they've been recruiting from around the world. There's talk about recruiting North Koreans, although I haven't seen it yet. They've been recruiting Cubans. I did a video about that, who didn't know that they were going to the front. Serbs are potentially going to be part of it, but I haven't seen a large movement of this, of any foreigners in Ukraine. Kuleba says that Zelensky not denied visit to Israel, but they had to determine a date because Zelensky wanted to, as a sign of solidarity, go to Israel and meet with Netanyahu. Hamas is likely used North Korean weapons, according to the Times of Israel. So I'm very careful about what I cite and what papers I read, because if you just look at something on Twitter, anyone can make something up. Times of Israel wouldn't say something like that lightly. Ukrainian court sentences an ex-police officers over the 2014 Maidan shootings. That was in Radio Free Europe, and I thought that was really interesting. What Putin actually was okay with was Yanukovych, in order to come closer to Russia, firing on his own people. He never has said that that was a bad idea, or that was, he never condemned that. What he wasn't okay with was not having a puppet or a close ally in Ukraine in power, and he calls that a coup. He calls that a coup, but there's no discussion of that the Russians actually were. And by the way, if you can provide something to me about this, what I'm about to say, I'd really appreciate it. He never talks about how the Russians actually fomented. It wasn't just that there was dissatisfaction in eastern Ukraine. The Russians actually fomented a breakaway civil war within Ukraine. But there's no discussion about that, although Putin regularly talks about a coup in 2014. So I would love to see more evidence about how Russia has fomented the separatist movement, the breakaway region in eastern Ukraine. Okay, Thursday, 19 October, Iran Gaza hospital attack marks the beginning of something big. Okay, so here's and the UK compares BBC's Gaza coverage to blood libel. There's a quote here with the blood libel one. The reporting of the tragic explosion at the Al Ali hospital by the BBC and others was like a 21st century blood libel, someone wrote on Twitter. This was covered in BBC. Historically, blood libels were a false accusation that Jews were killing Christian babies for ritual purposes. But the hospital attack wasn't an attack by Israel, it turns out. I mean, we found that out later in time, and it looks like it was a Palestinian rocket, not intentionally, but that had just gone awry, trying to fire on Israel. Okay, wanted thousands of Ukrainian judges and huge overhaul sought by the EU. So we talked about corruption extensively last week, and we need to fill these Ukrainian judges' seats with competent people who are able to administer justice. And this is kind of part of the Soviet hangover that there has been corruption, and they're trying to work that out. Russia's foreign minister hails a new level of ties during his North Korea trip. So if your mom used to say who you are is who your friends are, then Russia's hanging out with North Korea, Iran, Syria, Al-Qaeda. I mean, it's not a great bunch. Okay, Putin's cynical comment on civilian casualties is criticized by Germany. Quote, Schultz said, it makes me more than furious to hear a Russian president repeatedly warning that there could be civilian casualties from an armed conflict. And he was referring to Putin's comments about the Israel-Hamas war. Like, that's what Putin was talking about. Like, well, there could be these civilian casualties. Really? What do you think's happening in Ukraine? Biden draws a direct link between Putin and Hamas as he urges for Israel and Ukraine, or aid for Israel and Ukraine, and he was starting to do that more and more over time. And he did a live presidential address where he was connecting those dots. On Friday, 20 October, European leaders seethe over the Putin-Orban meeting. Orban is an interesting cat. He's the leader in Hungary, and he really just doesn't want to let go of his ties to Russia. In fact, I was reading, I think this morning, about how he compared the EU to the old Soviet Union. Like this is what, it's oppressive, like the old Soviet Union. No, you like Russia. Like, you could leave the EU theoretically, and anyway. Okay, pronounced concern in Russia about Ukraine's moves in the south, and there were reasons to be concerned. And there were the crossing of the Dnipro, but there's even more concern over Avdiivka, I'm sorry, and it's really interesting why the Russians just keep throwing themselves on the spear there. Okay, Biden declares Israel and Ukraine support is vital for U.S. security and will ask Congress for billions. Biden to seek to depoliticize Ukraine and Israel aid, show that Western support will not flag. So this is one of those things where, regardless of which party you're in, you should be seeing this as a nonpartisan issue, like Ukraine. It shouldn't be that because you're of this party or that party, you view Russia invading its democratic neighbor as one way or the other. You should just see it as bad. And there's a fraction of Republicans, a pretty substantial fraction, that have a it's not our problem kind of stance, and that's the wrong reaction. That's not a conservative view. That is a populist, isolationist maybe point of view, but that's not a conservative position. Republicans respond to Biden's Oval Office speech that mentioned Ukraine-Hamas war as unbelievable. Now, they had two different views of this. There are conservatives like me who were saying he's not been giving enough. He's finally making the argument, but he hasn't done enough. And then there are Republicans that are the Trumpian, populist, isolationist type saying, why is this our business? We need to stay out of it. It's costing too much money. Okay, so there's two different camps there. Biden sends $106 billion aid request to Congress for Israel, Ukraine, and Gaza. White House requests $61 billion of that 106 for Ukraine funding. North Korea, Kim says that Russia's agreement will be faithfully fulfilled. Those were two headlines in the same headline. And apparently Kim was working on that. Biden draws a direct link between Putin and Hamas, and so finally he's making the case and coupling these together, and I think that's the way to go forward. Can the U.S. stand with both Israel and Ukraine, asks an NPR headline. That's National Public Radio. The Prosecutor General says that Ukraine is the first in history to investigate environmental crimes as war crimes. Well, that's something. That's new. That's novel. But at least Nova Kahova, I'm not sure that all of them would necessarily fit, but at least the damage from the Nova Kahova Dam, $16 billion worth of damage, ought to be considered as a war crime. Russia is working to undermine trust in elections globally, and they have been for a number of years. This was just showing how they were doing that. The Israeli defense minister said that the goals of the war in Gaza Strip include elimination of Hamas. Now, I'm going to also have Israel-Gaza conflict as well as the Ukraine-Gaza in this because some of this impacts the other, and it's not quite clear which do, but where they do, I'm going to point that out. Zelensky, and this is Saturday, 21 October, Zelensky and Erdogan emphasized the need for protecting civilians in the Middle East. Now, this is one of those places where it's clear that these things impact each other. Zelensky came out with full-throated support for Israel. Erdogan came out to support the Palestinians in Gaza. But when they got together and talked, they were talking mostly about, support for Ukraine, but they agreed that civilians ought to be protected in Israel and Gaza. Now, that's great. That's exactly how you should be operating. I'm a conservative. We can find common ground between my mostly left-leaning audience and me on this because we're focused on this particular issue. On other things, school choice or other things, we can have different opinions on other issues, but we can find common ground where we can find common ground, and we should strive to find common ground. Okay, a third of Ukraine's territory is contaminated with mines. Think about that. A third of the country has mines in it. It's mind-boggling. There was a Russian strike on a Kharkiv distribution center that killed 6, and as what we know at this moment is that there are another 7 that are fighting for their lives right now, 23 other casualties beyond the 6 that we know were dead. Why Kyiv's Dnipro East Bank gain could be significant. If they can cross there, if they can create a beachhead and they can move material and men over there, they can start creating a real headache for the Russians. Ukraine claims that Russia has committed 2,500 environmental crimes during the full-scale invasion. Now, I don't know how they're accounting for that. That's a lot. I mean, there's a lot of damage that has happened. Okay, Ukraine says that it took out almost 50 tanks in one day, and this is day after day after day of the Russians trying to take Avdiivka and not being able to do it and getting decimated and then coming back the next day. I can't remember where I read it, but somewhere I read that Putin wants to have all the way to the borders of Donetsk by the end of the year. And so that's the only thing that I understand how to interpret this foolish attack of Avdiivka. Okay, Sunday, 22 October, RT says that the U.S. to deploy additional air defense systems near Israel. 3 weapons that Israel and Ukraine both need from the Ukraine. This was another headline, and that was in the New York Times. It was really interesting. So it's standard artillery shells. Okay, we know that the Ukrainians need it, but they got it from a stockpile in Israel, and then the U.S. is replenishing that stockpile and going to divert some of them to Israel. Okay, the second one was small diameter bombs, and the third one was Stinger missiles. But beyond those 3 categories, the way that they're going to have to fight in Israel is different than the way that they're going to have to fight in Ukraine. So there's not a lot of competition for other weapons. Okay, Russian soldiers are digging tunnels to sneak up on Ukrainian positions without being seen by lethal drones, according to a Business Insider article. Now, I generally don't put a lot of faith in Business Insider unless it's clearly from a different paper, just carried from a different paper. You got to be careful. It's not the same level as the Times or the Guardian or the Wall Street Journal or what have you. Okay, has Ukraine fulfilled one of the main EU requirements? Okay, this was a great article. Yes, Ukraine is moving toward integration with the European Union. And there is a quote here on October 17th. Parliament supported an important law in the field of combating money laundering. It's called the Law on PEPs, or Politically Exposed Persons. Essentially, they don't want people who are in high positions to be able to be bribed, or we want to make sure that if they are, they can be caught very quickly, and so to put the kibosh on corruption. That's a very important thing, particularly for European Union integration at this point. And Zelensky and the administration want to move headlong that way. They were working on a bill on considering corruption to be treason. Okay, that was Sunday. Monday, 23 October. Putin pushes more soldiers to the front line despite a failing offensive. I can't figure it out other than his deep desire to get there, and I can imagine that his commanders all the way up the chain are not telling him the real truth about how bad Avdiivka is. Zelensky says special thanks to soldiers in Avdiivka direction. Russia deploys reinforcements to Avdiivka's, the front line, despite heavy losses. It's mind-boggling, but it's a thing. That's what's going on. There was an article that talked about, can the Russian army be that stupid? Talking about Avdiivka. Yes, they are being that stupid. What's happening is they'll put this column of tanks in, and as soon as they get to a certain position, the Ukrainians will fire mines behind and on top of the tanks. If they can get it on top of the tanks, great. They win a victory. They can blow the tank. If they fire behind the tanks can't get out without going over the mines. They win a victory. There was another article that showed that they were using remote control cars to rush out in front of tanks and drop the mines there. I mean, it's pretty amazing what the Ukrainians have been able to do. But the Russians, are they that stupid? They're not stupid. They're not smart, but their commanders keep ordering them back out to do the same thing again and again. And well, that's where we are. Okay, last article, McConnell backs Biden's $106 billion in aid, but the real thing to watch will be what happens in the House of Representatives, as they're still working on getting a Speaker of the House. Okay, that's it for the update for this week. I'm sorry it was late, but hopefully that provides you extra context about what was going on. Thank you for being the kind of person that watches this, that listens to it. Thank you for the likes that make this get magnified, the shares, the subscribes, the coffees, and thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.